Cathy Chambless, and I want to tell you about what we're going to do today. Today's Summer Forum is the second in our series on water and Great Salt Lake. 2 weeks ago, we focused on urban water users, residential and business users in Salt Lake County and Salt Lake City. And today, we're widening our lens to focus on the Great Basin. Today we have, our speaker is the Director of Water Resources for the state, Candice Hasenyager, and I'll introduce her in a minute, but we want to start out with our usual ritual of lighting the chalice. So I've chosen for today's reading to read an excerpt from the poem Irreplaceable, a collective poem celebrating Great Salt Lake that was the writing of which was facilitated by Nan Seymour and represents over 100 people who've written this poem. I'm just going to read an excerpt that was written by Rachel White, and she is speaking to the lake. This is called, the title of it is verse 13, Great Vortex. Great Salt Lake, great vortex and crossroads of hemispheric importance, testament that water is life, great oasis in a vast desert, the Great Basin for 10 million birds who rest in mysteriously beautiful, ever-changing light, the great and complex web of home for 330 million species who continue to live as they have for millennia because of you, your great life-giving waters. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Candice Hasenyager. Candice serves as the Director of the Division of Water Resources. She is a scientist and a civil engineer. She's worked on water resource projects since 2007, and as administrator of a state agency, Candice is at the nexus of policymaking and implementation for finding solutions for the water conundrum in our communities, valleys, and the Great Basin. She graduated from the University of Utah with a Bachelor of Science and Master of Science in Civil Engineering. As is our custom, Candice will speak for 20 to 30 minutes, and after that we will take a short break to pass the collection plate, and then we'll have a Q&A session. So let's start with that. And Candice, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here this morning. What a beautiful chapel, and thank you for inviting me into your community to talk about two of my favorite subjects, water and the Great Salt Lake. So state agencies, we have at least 4 that deal with water in the state. So just to give a little background on my agency, the Division of Water Resources, our mission is to plan, conserve, develop, and protect Utah's water resources. We are tasked with ensuring we have one of the most basic and critical resources available now and into the future. And I just have to give a shout out because our most valuable asset at Water Resources is our amazing staff. They are hardworking and passionate individuals who are driven by our mission. Their work ensures that we have this critical resources now and into the future. So just really grateful to get to work with such great people. So I know it's Sunday morning, and to start it off, we're gonna have a little audience participation. So I want you to think for a second, and my friends on Zoom, please do the same, about how you used water this morning. And then just raise your hand and I'll call on you. Yes?
I washed my dishes.
Oh, someone washed their dishes. Great. What else?
Shower.
You showered.
Make my coffee.
You coffee?
Brush my teeth.
You brushed your teeth?
I water my trees.
You watered your trees? Any friends on Zoom? Do they have any? Not yet? Yes, ma'am.
Flush the toilet.
You flushed the toilet? Yes. That's very important. Yep, up there.
I didn't flush the toilet.
You didn't flush the toilet. There you go. Anybody else?
Laundry.
You did some laundry? Anybody else? Did anybody? Oh, go ahead, sir.
Maybe. I think of ice water.
Ice water. Yes, one of our favorites on a hot summer day.
So I ran hot water for 3 minutes to clean out the drains. We do that at Friendship Manor every Sunday.
Oh, that's great. That's awesome. Did anyone turn on a light this morning? Did anyone charge a cell phone? Did anybody eat food? Did anyone put on clothes? I see everyone's well dressed today, so it looks like we all put on clothes. So from the food we eat, the clothes we wear, the chairs you're sitting in, the cars we drove, or the bicycle you rode here, water is at the heart of our society, and really water is life. So Cathy, you couldn't have picked a more appropriate excerpt from that poem for my presentation today. Great Salt Lake is so important, and people always ask, well, why? Why is it important? And you guys are well informed, and you guys probably already know this, but really it is part of the state's economy. It's essential to our wildlife and our environment. $1.3 billion of Utah's economy comes from Great Salt Lake and provides over 7,000 jobs. It's critical habitat for 10 million migratory birds each year. We get specific resources off it. And we'll talk about some of the impacts of a declining lake, but this is just the namesake of our city and so important for our lives. And if you look at this picture, you're like, what do those three things have in common? They all have a tie to Great Salt Lake. So if you've eaten shrimp, it was likely fed by brine shrimp. If you drink out of a soda can or LaCroix, whatever your beverage of choice is, the magnesium likely came from Great Salt Lake. Almonds and other high-valued produce and products use sulfate of potash that comes from Great Salt Lake. And as we're moving into this electrified world, there are people who are looking at the possibility of getting lithium out of Great Salt Lake as our lithium sources around the world become more and more challenging. So it is a unique body of water, and it has so many things that it gives our society. So if we look at kind of the big picture on Great Salt Lake, there was the record high, which was a while ago, was in 1986. About 4,212 feet was the elevation in the South Arm. That's when we were looking at about how can we move water away from Great Salt Lake because it was getting so full. On average, it's roughly about 4,200 acre feet. So these are just some aerial overviews that you can kind of see the different lake levels and their impacts. In 2022, we hit an unfortunate record low of 4188.5, and then this year we peaked at about 4195. So that's just kind of how you can visually see. Notice the shorelines, where it changes, how much exposed lake bed there is. All of those things have an impact. Also, the salinity is a really important point as well. And you guys all probably know this, but just to make sure you can see, there's a causeway that goes across it. So it kind of separated the kind of two arms, the north arm and the south arm. You can see different coloring. There's different salinities in both of those. And that has an impact to wildlife, to mineral extraction, and all of those things. So where have we been? What are we doing? So we've seen this downward trend in Great Salt Lake, particularly in 2021 and 2022. In 2021, we hit a record low of 4190 at the time. Our previous record low was set in 1963. And then in 2022, we then again dropped below that to our current record low of 4188.5. Right now, we're about 4194, and I know these are a bunch of numbers, but you can kind of see how Great Salt Lake has changed, and this is only since 2008, so it doesn't go all the way back to the 80s. But you can see we've seen a downward trend. We have seen, obviously, with the last couple of years of snowpack, good snowpack, we have seen increases in the elevation of both the north and the south arm, which are great. We're not there yet, though. We still have a lot of work to do. One of the things that's really important to understand is Great Salt Lake is massive, right? This is this huge body of water. It evaporates a lot of water. So on average, the inflows are roughly around 2 million acre feet. In 2021 and 2022, they were about 1 million. So the Great Salt Lake only rose about 1 foot. So significant challenges as we have declining inflows in the Great Salt Lake. So this is a really complex basin. As I said, it's massive, 36,000 square miles. There's 4 states, 18 counties, 141 cities, 70 groundwater aquifers, 1,300 reservoirs, and roughly 150 water rights in the basin. So that's technically, there's a lot of complexity there. It's also socially complex with 2.8 million humans, 1.5 million acres of farmland, roughly 7,000 acres of urban acres, 184,000 of wetlands. We have behaviors, attitudes, and values of all of these different people on all of these different water users. And so what are the real potential costs to a drying Great Salt Lake? One of the biggest concerns is dust, right? That directly impacts our health. We can have reduced lake access. There's even safety concerns during that really record drought or record low levels that we saw of even getting a boat into the lake if an airplane, right? We all know the Salt Lake Airport flies over to Great Salt Lake a lot. So if an airplane went down, we were concerned about access and safety issues. Increased salinity impacts the ecosystem, and then it can impact our snowpack as well. One from 2 ways. One is lake effect snow. We all love that, when that storm moves over, picks up all the precipitation and then drops it on the Wasatch Front. Makes it for great skiing and all those things. That's really important, but also the impact of dust on snow. And this is kind of a technical subject, but I think it's one that we should all understand, is as we get more dust into our environment and as it lands on the snow, it changes the albedo, which once again is a technical term, but just makes it so that it absorbs more radiation and solar energy, so it melts quicker. And so it's a real big concern as we rely on our snowpack for our water supply. Just so you guys know, about 95% of our water supply comes from our snowpack, so it's really important. And then there's also the economic potential costs, right? Between 1.7 and 2.2 billion of potential costs annually coming from lost mineral extraction, mitigation, recreation, brine shrimp, health costs, and even lost ski days, which are important to, I know, a number of people. I feel like I've just thrown so much data at you. So I apologize. So one of the things is people ask a lot is, what are we doing? And so I didn't feel like I could talk to you guys about all the things that we're doing without talking about the significant investment that the state has made toward trying to save Great Salt Lake. So direct funding of Great Salt Lake programs, once again, here's a whole litany of lists, right? From the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan, there's different planning components. Has anyone heard of the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office? Yeah, so our friend Commissioner Steed runs that office, but he's really the wrangler of all of the different people and state agencies that are involved. And so that created his office, trying to get water directly to Great Salt Lake, berm management, all of these different things. So if you look directly at Great Salt Lake programs, about 72 million are going directly to Great Salt Lake. And then if you take a little broader lens on different statewide funding for water conservation, wetland restoration, endangered species, all that Great Salt Lake benefits from, that's another huge amount of about $490 million going towards statewide programs. So pretty significant. And then I had a bunch of slides on legislation that's been passed. I hope this presentation will be available to your members. I'll make sure it's available. But you can go through and kind of look at whether it's mineral extraction you're interested, different studies, air quality, additional education regarding water use, water reuse and that potential impacts and regulations on that, the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office, water efficient landscaping incentives, agricultural optimization, in-stream flows, Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust, Great Salt Lake amendments, which had the Division of Water Resources, is having the Division of Water Resources create a Great Salt Lake Watershed Integrated Water Assessment. So there's been a lot going on over the last several years, which is great. It's important. You know, when we sit down and we kind of lay out all the pieces to a puzzle, you know, you kind of start with the edges, then you start filling them in. Well, we started working on that in Great Salt Lake as we saw these critical levels hit and we were leading up to it. And then we realized there's kind of gaps in our knowledge base. And so that's one of the things that the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan is supposed to do, is to create a water budget for the basin as well as to help fill in some of those specific gaps. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you for just a few minutes, and then I'll talk about some of the big water conservation efforts that are going on, and then I think we'll be just about at time. But so with the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan that the legislature, they called it the Great Salt Lake Watershed Integrated Water Assessment. At the same time, we also applied for a Bureau of Reclamation Water Smart grant, and so we kind of merged those into what we're calling the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan. So we have about $8 million for that planning effort to really help understand Great Salt Lake and understand the trade-offs of how we make decisions. So we have a steering committee that helped us develop this challenge statement, and it's really ensuring a resilient water supply requires extraordinary vision, collaborative effort. Our solutions remain socially and technically complex as demands on this limited water resource continue to increase. Today's water management decisions shape tomorrow's possibilities. So we've already kind of talked and laid out the challenge, both social and technical. And so our goal is to ensure that a resilient water supply for Great Salt Lake and all water users, including people, the environment, and the watershed. So we just really want to continue to shape our understanding on Great Salt Lake and then be able to understand how that impacts how we make decisions. It's been one of the challenges of the last several years as we hit these kind of critical levels and had gaps in our knowledge. We didn't have the best tools necessarily to predict what the decision would be. So that's really the goal of this. And, you know, people say, well, we should have done this 10 years ago. I totally agree. But we all know that saying that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but if we don't do it then, let's do it now. So we're doing it now. So our objectives are to forge connections, develop shared understanding, quantify our water resources, evaluate options, and recommend actions. So Great Salt Lake is, just like all of our water systems, are very connected, right? Our snow falls up in the mountains. It comes down, goes into reservoirs and pipelines and rivers, and is moved throughout the basin. It's used on agriculture, used on in our homes, in our yards, goes to our wastewater treatment facilities. Some places reuse a certain amount of water, and then a bunch gets to Great Salt Lake, and then it kind of starts that whole process all over again. So really we're trying to create partnerships between all of the different water users and all the different ways that we use and move water through our system, and state, federal, and our local water users and participants. And so one of the important things, if you're like, well, how do I get involved in the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan? One, you can reach out to me. Two, through your watershed councils, we are using those. So this is an effort that was actually from 2020 to develop a statewide watershed council and then local watershed councils. So the Jordan River Commission has become the watershed council for this area. So if you're in the Salt Lake County, you can look them up. Soren Simonson is a great guy, and he definitely would enjoy your participation. But that's one of the ways we're accessing people and getting information. So really trying to answer specific questions regarding Great Salt Lake is, how do we build a resilient water supply for the Great Salt Lake in the basement? And what kind of understanding do we need to have? What and how much water is available? How much water do our community's environment need, and why? What about water quality? What about our watersheds and forest management? What about stormwater? How much water does Great Salt Lake need and at what level? And there's all these different things that we're working on through this process. So this is a kind of a longer term project. We started it in roughly 2023, and then we developed a work plan, and now we're quantifying resources. We've established a list of studies and things that we're working on to kind of fill in those gaps in our understanding, and then really that water budget to be able to do a trade-off analysis. So this is an ongoing process, which you can find at our it's gslbasinplan.utah.gov, but that's a great place to go and learn more about it. You're happy to reach out to me or through your watershed council. We'd be happy to get you guys more information. So where are we? What are the good things? When I look in the future, one of the really important things is that we have choices, which is amazing, right? We have choices in how we grow, how we use water, what products we buy, what businesses we bring into our communities. So I think it's really important that's a realization that we all have choices. So when we think about long-term conservation, there's really three buckets that we kind of look at three pieces to the puzzle. One is regulation. You can regulate it. One is through incentives, the carrot and the stick approach. And then the next is through education. And so we're tackling it in all three of these ways. We did an analysis of how much because this is one of the questions the legislature had, is how much can $1 million get us? And are we doing the biggest bang for the buck, right? Are we doing the things that are most important? And so if you look at the amount of acre feet per $1 million invested, secondary metering was by far the biggest winner. And so that is something that the legislature legislated, that they require meters for all secondary meters, and they put in a significant investment into that. Turf buyback, which is just, if you think about removing any thirsty grasses and putting water-wise landscaping, that can save a bunch of water as well. Smart controllers, even just getting better with how we irrigate right now, toilets, shower heads. And so we're doing all of these things and putting money into them. So the first one is secondary meters that I talked a little bit about, but $250 million has been authorized and committed by the Board of Water Resources. We have $220 million in grants contracted. And then there was a requirement to have a 30% cost share from the locals. So for the locals to be able to meet that, they were able to come to the Board of Water Resources for loans, so about $67 million. So to date, we're about 30,000 meters have been installed, and we anticipate another 85,000 by the end of 2026. So that money is being implemented and put on the ground. It says it right at the top, but the average water reduction savings is between 20 and 30%. So it's a significant investment and a great way to save water. And that's really just knowing how much water we use. Another program is that kind of turf buyback program. So removing our thirsty grasses, putting in water-rights landscaping can save about 2/3 of water compared to a traditional landscaping. So I'll talk about this in just a second, but one of the really, interesting is not the right word. One of the really important pieces to this is that we did put on a restriction that cities have to adopt water efficiency standards in order for their residents to be eligible for these incentives. So not to give them too much grief, but my city hasn't adopted these standards yet, even though I've been contacting them and pushing them toward that, so I hope they do it soon. So I feel the pain of those who are in cities who haven't had their cities adopt water efficiency standards and they're not eligible for these rebates yet. But the reason why we did it is because it's kind of like you're always chasing your tail, right? If you go in and you remove grass and then the developer comes in and lays it down, it's like, what are we doing here? So we want to build right the first time, and that's a big focus. So about 58% of Utahns are in eligible locations. We're working with some large water conservancy districts to make this program possible. We raised some water conservancy district, Jordan Valley, Central Utah, and Washington County. And then the Division of Water Resources is covering the rest of the state. So we've made some tremendous progress since the program launched last year. We have a long ways to go, but we're still going. So 3 million square feet of grass has been replaced in 2023, and so far in 2024 we have about 500 projects completed. There's rebates available, and these are statewide rebates. So if you have an old toilet or you don't have a smart controller yet, you can go to Utah Water Savers and find rebates for those statewide programs. And I did talk a little bit about this, but historically, how land use planners and water planners have worked together is they haven't really. They've been really siloed. It hasn't been integrated, and so there's been this pretty significant approach or effort to cross over and make sure that we're planning as wisely as possible. How we grow matters. It sets our water use patterns for decades to come, so it's really important that we just don't assume that the water is going to be there, that we plan and grow accordingly. What about agriculture? Agriculture uses a lot of water, right? Does anyone know by chance how much water ag uses?
70%.
Roughly, yeah. Over the last 5 years, about 75% of the diverted flows is used by agriculture. And there's a lot of complexity with water rights and all of those different types of things, but the state has invested a significant amount of money into helping agriculture use water more wisely. It's through the Agricultural Water Optimization Program. $276 million was appropriated for that program, and it's making its way. It's slower. One of the other things that's really important to note from a policy consideration that happened last year in 2023 was they changed the water rights law to allow for what they call saved water. So, because one of the concerns or the things that I've always heard is that if a farmer saves water, they just lose it, right? Because it'll go down to the next water user, and so they just continue to use it. So now they have the ability to, through the state engineer's office, which is a different office of the state, but they can apply for a saved water change application, and they could do something different with that water. So they could lease it to Great Salt Lake, or they could do other things. So what can you do to help? Obviously, I had a great chat with Cathy at the beginning of this morning when I got here, and one of the things that we all need to start working on is working together. We're all responsible for how we use water in the state, how we products we purchase, where we visit, where we shop. It all comes together, and I just think it's really important that we all be at the table. I often hear in my role, and I just heard it 2 weeks ago when I was presenting to an economic development group about, well, if I save water, it just goes downstream. I don't have a big reservoir above me, so it just goes to Utah Lake or Great Salt Lake. And I'm not trying to be neighborly, I'm not trying to not be neighborly or anything. And at the end of the day, I think we all need to be neighborly to be able to kind of save this problem, or to save the lake and to address this problem. And so we all need to participate. I know you guys are already involved and interested in educating yourselves. Join the Watershed Council. Look up at the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan. There's also opportunities to donate water, or donate money or water if you have that to the Great Salt Lake Enhancement Trust. So pretty exciting things that are occurring. That being said, this is a overlay of the lake. So this is from, and I tried not to show too many graphs, even though I'm an engineer, and it's like, trying to claw back teeth there. But anyways, on the x-axis, so this bottom axis is time from 1906 through 2025, really. And then the y-axis is elevation. And then it has the different bars of where the lake is in the healthy range. So really the lake is in a healthy range, right in this green area. And then there's adverse effects if it gets too high, and there's adverse effects if it gets too low. You can see during some of our biggest drought years, in 2021 and 2022, we are in this serious adverse effects area. We bumped up to this transitionary area, but we still have a long ways to go before we get to that healthy lake level. Pat Bagley is always great about putting out good and relevant information in an amazing form. We still have a long ways to go, but it's really great that we had 2 good water years. That does help. We're not there yet, though. And then I know I threw a bunch of information at you, so I did want to give a shout out. My team, Leila Ahmadi and Tom Moore, developed this amazing story map where you can go explore. You can go look at agricultural water use, learn about that. You can look at residential. You can look at lake. So it's a very long greatsaltlake.utah.gov, Great Salt Lake Basin story map. I'm sure if you just Googled it, you can find that. I had it pulled up as well, so we can, if you guys want to, we can explore it, but I think I'm out of time. So I'll just say thank you there, and let's go to the next thing.
So we've got several hands here. Let's see, Rick in the back.
Yes, hello, I'm Rick Bliss. My wife and I live in Bluffdale. We have several acres down there. We have a lot of lawn. And a couple weeks ago, we had someone here from Salt Lake City who was responsible for water conservation. And she said she did not necessarily recommend eliminating lawns because they provide cooling. And what she recommended was changing the grass type from to a more drought tolerant. And we have been doing that. We got IFA's Escalante version of grass. And with that, you can cut your water usage down by half or 2/3 and still have the cooling effect of grass. So have you considered that sort of thing in your plans there?
That's a great question, and I think that creative and innovative solutions will have to be used by all of us. And I was just having a conversation, I didn't get your name, Patty, about the importance of landscaping. We are not asking people to just remove all their lawn and go to rock. We actually have requirements to have a 50% plant coverage. If there is any, if you participate in a rebate program or incentive program. So that's a great option. I would say the challenge with that is you still have issues with how water is applied. While the grass might use less water, people may not. You, Rick, probably are going to know how to water that, and you're going to water it right. If you sell that property, the next homeowner, or they may not know how to water it. You also have issues with distribution uniformity, evaporation. So really the most effective way to water plants is at the root, so with drip irrigation, so you're not getting that overhead spray. So we still recommend that if you're the only time you're walking on it is when you mow it once a week, it probably could be something else. So landscaping is super important, has great cooling effects. We were just talking about the urban heat island effect. It's a great option for areas that you want to maintain as grass. But if you really want to go to that next level, moving to drip irrigation, reducing overhead spray is really going to kind of make the big difference. So, great job, though.
Krista, right behind Lee there.
I know that it's not likely to happen, but if they were to remove that causeway in Great Salt Lake and make that restored to what it should be, would that have an advantage?
It's a great question and probably very complicated. So right now the north arm is hypersaline. It's like, if I'm remembering correctly, like 28 to 30% salt. So it's very salty. The south arm, when it was at its high, was roughly 18%, which is too high. The healthy range is between 10 to 12% salinity. And so one of the concerns of doing that is if you remove that causeway all of a sudden, then you're going to eventually have the mixing of that water, and you're going to increase the salinity of the whole lake, which could impact the ecosystem. So now that we've built that causeway, there could be some concerns about it. The other thing that, because it is there now, it's actually a tool in which we used last year. The Salinity Advisory Group recommended raising the berm. So on that long causeway, there's a very large bridge across it to allow for water to mix between the two arms. But they raised the berm pretty much closing off the north arm to protect the salinity in the south arm. And there's reduced evaporation because there's less flowing over that larger area. So it's complicated. It would have some definite impacts if we did make that choice. And at this point, I don't know if it would be for the benefit of the lake. I think it would make it all too salty, in my opinion.
Thank you. Let's, Steve, you have a question?
So with what the legislature has done, things like the agricultural optimization and secondary water metering, it's really helpful in the long term. And the question becomes, do we need to do something in the short term? And what I'm wondering is, when we only had 1 million acre feet coming into the lake during the drought conditions, the lake levels just fell off a cliff. Do the higher groundwater levels and so forth that we have from the last couple of winters buy us time in case we have another couple of really severe drought years? Or are we just going to fall off just the way it did in the past?
That's a great question. And groundwater, I didn't cover it that much in my talk. Groundwater is actually a really big concern. Our groundwater levels are continuing to drop. And in drought periods, which makes sense to a lot of people, there's a tendency to pump your groundwater more in drought years when you don't have the surface water. So there's that issue, is that our groundwater levels probably aren't as healthy as we would like them. And then it also takes time, right? It takes time for these 2 big drought years to infiltrate into the ground, make it to our aquifers. So it's not an immediate response. So I don't think groundwater is our solution for our surface water problems, if that helped.
Thank you.
We have a question on Zoom. Tristan.
Yeah, this question comes from Jim Catano. He asks, since the Great Salt Lake Basin spreads over 4 states, if those states don't respond aggressively to preserving the lake, can the federal government regulate this interstate navigable waterway and impose measures like limiting the production of alfalfa for export by imposing a severance tax on alfalfa that isn't used to feed livestock within the basin?
So yes, the federal government could be involved, especially if there was a endangered species listing or other things. There is an effort for sure to work within the Bear River Commission, which represents the three big states on the Bear River, not the 3 major states in the Bear River, Wyoming, sorry, I've been working on the Colorado River side a lot too. Wyoming, Idaho, and Utah. And then the portion in Nevada contributes a pretty small amount. So yes, the federal government could get involved. We are working to not have the federal government involved. We are trying to solve this on our terms, because you never know what you're going to get when a court comes and tells you what to do.
You mentioned that secondary metering it would be helpful to solve the problem, and I may be the only person here, but could you help us understand what that means?
Yes, thank you for asking. That's a great question. So secondary metering, as farms have transitioned from farmland into development, there was a time back in the 40s and the 50s where they, instead of treating that water to drinking water standards, they said, well, let's just create a secondary system that provides irrigation water, so it's untreated water, doesn't go to every home. Most of the homes in the Salt Lake Valley don't have secondary water. A lot happens north, Davis, Weber, Cache Valley, and then in some of the rural parts of the state. But because this water was it is dirty water, right? It's not clean, that the previous meters that we used for drinking water would get gummed up. They had moving parts and pieces in them, and so they couldn't measure how much water. So historically, people had an assessment, however much water they got, but it was unmetered. So what this allows now with technology and innovation, we have a meter that can read this water. And so we're incentivizing putting it on. And then by people just knowing how much water they use, they reduce water 20 to 30%. Not even getting into how much we pay for water, which is probably a whole other discussion that we could have that could benefit reducing how much water we use. But just even knowing how much can change our water use patterns.
So, considering that temperatures are increasing, evaporation happens, there's been a lot of talk about how the dust flying around can affect our air. How close are we to being affected by dust flying around? And what is the remedy, which is, of course, to fill the lake?
Yeah. So I'd say dust impacts us today, right? Some of it comes off of Great Salt Lake, some of it doesn't. Some comes from the severe lakebed, which was another terminal lake that has dried up. But if anyone lives near a gravel area and there's a lot of dust, that can impact us. So that is the big concern, right? Is that by the elevation of Great Salt Lake dropping, it's going to expose more lakebed. One of the good things about having Great Salt Lake be a salty lake is there is currently a salt crust that kind of holds that soil in place. That being said, it won't last forever. And so there have been research done regarding where the hot spots are and where we're seeing the most dust coming off the lake. And so what is the solution? Great question. There's been a significant amount of research done in Owens Valley and by the near the Salton Sea in California about how to best mitigate dust in these drying water bodies. And what they found really after a lot of research is water is the best tool to reduce how much dust comes off them. They've done a lot of experiments. They've put down rock fields, they've planted them. I went out and visited the Salton Sea and saw they used 750,000 straw bales that they lined up on the shore and then tried to put plants into between them to kind of create wind barriers. So there's lots of things we could do, but the best thing we should do is put water on the lake.
I just wonder about private water companies. We have a private water company close to where I live, and I know that the people who use that water use it indiscriminately. Is there ever going to be something to eliminate that? How many private water companies are there? Are they regulated in any way? I know that's a lot of questions, but that's what I see, and I just have wondered about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. Private water companies. So water rights in the state are a public right, and people have the right, or a public resource, and people have the right to use that water, whether it's for a farm or for cities. And so with these, whether it's a public water supplier or a private water user, they're all regulated by the state engineer, so the Division of Water Rights. So that's one thing. They are regulated. That being said, there's probably not enough enforcement actions. It takes an effort to get an enforcement action out, just because of the vast scale that the Division of Water Rights has to manage. And they do an amazing job. Teresa Williamson, our state engineer, and her team are really great. I think one of the challenges, and I'm going to take it a little beyond just private water rights. So, for example, I had a legislature reach out to me during the drought and says, and this legislature is a great legislator, maybe not the most powerful, and she was very concerned because she said, well, I'm only allowed to water once a week. And my neighbor across the street that happens to live in another city can water as much as they want. And I think going into the future, and that's between two public water systems because they have a different water rights, different portfolio, different water supplies. But I think going into the future, that's going to be a harder pill to swallow, right? We're going to have to figure out how to create equity within our water use, our water rates. I had the opportunity to go to Israel, and that's one of the things that I learned is that, one, they have a very different governmental process surrounding water, and I don't know if we'll ever get there. But the other thing is that everyone pays the same amount. Every sector, so residential sector, whether they live right next to the desalinization plant or they live out in the Negev desert, they pay the same amount. And so I think trying to develop that availability and equity within water will be one of our challenges to come.
Question back there.
The secondary metering targets from property types, what percentage is residential versus commercial versus any other property types that are being targeted? Was the focus of the legislation on residential?
So it was really for secondary water suppliers, and to be honest, I don't know the breakdown because every secondary water supplier kind of has a different portfolio. The majority of them are, if you're talking about connections, are residential connections, but that doesn't necessarily mean the largest water users are residential, right? I mean, if you have a large school that has a lot of green space, you could use a lot of water on it that is more than all the residential water users combined. So they're really focused on secondary water suppliers.
Let's get a question over here. Good questions, really sharp, good questions. Thank you.
When dust was discussed, at the end of that conversation, you talked about the solution is to put more water in the lake is more effective, saltancy and all these things. What do those options look like? You briefly touched on some, like desalinization, but that can be really complicated. Funding can be complicated. Putting water up into a big high basin, such as the Great Basin, that still involves a lot of power to push water up this high. And it can be difficult to find funding for those things. And we saw some funding for some neat projects. What does that look like right now? Can you help us see what the state is considering as far as what are the best options look like so far? I know you're still investigating.
Yeah, so one of the big things is the best water is our water, our closest water, right? To use our water within our basins as wisely as possible. We already have importation projects from the Colorado River and those type of things. So we are already have imported water into this basin. And so trying to use our water as wisely as possible in this basin, whether that's through leasing, if a agricultural producer, doesn't want to water their crops for the next 2 years for whatever reason, and they want to, lease their water. There's opportunities to lease water. There's opportunities to sell water. So that's kind of one way is the probably most direct mechanism is through water rights holders. And then the other piece is, and this is a conversation that I have a lot as well, is like, well, as a residential water user, if I save water, I live in Ogden, it likely just stays in Pineview. Like, it doesn't necessarily, because I save water, doesn't mean it makes it to Great Salt Lake. But in general, if we're all using less water, when we do have those bigger water years, they're going to have more water come down into the basin and into Great Salt Lake. So that's kind of like our first kind of line of defense, is how we use water within our state, trying to use it as wisely as possible. There has been a significant push to, let's get water from somewhere else. And I can tell you, while we're investigating that, it's going to be very challenging. Significant hurdles. No other state in the West is like, you can take my water. We don't get those people. I don't get those calls. So, not saying that there's not possibility and that we're not looking at it. We are. I just don't think it's like a silver bullet approach for what we need right now. If that helps.
Okay, question over there.
Yeah, I had a question about non-agricultural industrial use. By the way, thank you for all the information. It's great to hear from an engineer on the subject, and you came well equipped with a lot of data. And what jumped out at me was the $1.3 billion from mineral extraction use. And I was wondering, everybody's heard about the use to water alfalfa. And sometimes we hear about the industrial use. And you mentioned potash and magnesium, and I guess salt might be in that equation too. Is that industrial use, does that use a lot of water? And why doesn't the water just go back into the lake if that's where it's coming from?
Great question. So yes, mineral extraction off of the lake uses water. I'm trying to remember the exact, I think it's like 10%, 15%, if I'm remembering correctly. So one of the concerns is while that's not as significant as some of the other uses within the state, it's at the end of the line, right? It's on Great Salt Lake. So when Great Salt Lake hit record lows, I mean, if the canal went far enough into the lake, they could still extract water. And why does that water not get to the lake? Because a lot of these extraction industries, for example, when you're talking about sulfate of potash, they pump the water out of the lake, they put it in these wide ponds that are designed to evaporate more effectively. So it evaporates the water, and then they go in and scoop it up. They do have to do some flushing things where they flush it with water and then dump that back into Great Salt Lake and then start the process over again. But the majority of that water is just evaporated much more effectively than in the lake, which already evaporates a lot of water. So it is an important piece. There was actually some legislation this last year to regulate what mineral extraction industries can take out of Great Salt Lake when it's in those unhealthy ranges. So we're currently working, the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands and the Division of Water Rights are currently working to implement that legislation. So that still has a little ways to go, but it's kind of is a good safety net when we hit those really low levels. But we do have a long ways to go there too.
Okay, we have time for, I think, one or two more questions. So right here, are you raising your hand?
Yeah, John was raising his hand.
You got it?
Candice, so if we save 20 to 30% on conservation and then just grow into it with other sort of hard demand, i.e. new growth, is that savings, and do we want inefficiencies in the system for flexibility, I guess?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I knew you were going to have the hardest question. I'm just kidding. You know, that is the concern, and I hear it often with when we talk about conservation. During the drought, how many of you had your drinking water shut off? No one. No, everyone had drinking water in 2021 and 2022. How many of you had a yellow lawn or dead lawn? Right? A lot of us, rather than having our drinking water impacted, we all made the decision to save water. We're going to water less outside. So that's what John's talking about when he's talking about hardening demand, is if we don't have that kind of inefficiency in the system to allow for that water to be used somewhere else or to stop watering our lawn, then it may start impacting more important things like drinking water. And so that is a concern. And that's why I said you had the hardest question, is how we get there. I think we have a long ways to go before we're that hardened where we're going to have our impact be drinking water. And so I think it is important for all of us to start moving toward getting more efficient so that we can do that. I mean, the other thing, as far as you talked about growth and what that looks like, and that's a challenge too, right? And that depends on every local community on what they want to look like. Do they want their kids to be able to live in their area? Do they, or do they want them to have to move somewhere else? Right now, I mean, I would say our housing prices are causing some concerns that way. I don't know if my kid will ever be able to buy a house right now. Hopefully he can someday. But I think that is the concern, is that we probably should be very wise and know that water will likely not stop growth, but limit growth in the future, because it is just a limited resource.
Let's let that be our last question, and let's give a hand to our speaker. So I have a few announcements before we closed. I want to remind everyone that this evening we're having a summer sundown service. It starts at 6:15, but there's a potluck at 5:30. It's here. Potluck's next door, and the service starts at 6:15 in the chapel here. Also, next Sunday, our summer forum topic is the implications of psychedelics for the alleviation of suffering, the bettering of the well, and the enrichment of religion. So that will be a very interesting topic next on July 28th. Also, our food drive for Crossroads Urban Center is still going on this month. And so bring any canned goods that would be for Crossroads Urban Center anytime during the month of July, but next Sunday is the last Sunday. Also, there's many other activities read about in the Torch. I also want to remind people to please visit our environmental ministry table in Elliott Hall as you have coffee and conversation. Joan Gregory's here, and we have lots of important information being passed out there. And I think with that, we will end our service. I'll extinguish the chalice, and thank you very much, Candice. Please join us for coffee next door.